Hello everyone and welcome to this. This is week 10 and we are looking at Congress in your Politics 1010 class. We have a number of things to address in relation to Congress today, and we're going to try to focus on the aspects, I think, that speak to our core themes for this semester, namely the sort of tension and struggle once again between elite and popular democratic sort of aspirations. We are going to talk first of all about the Individualistic Congress, which we might consider to be the sort of more traditional configuration of how Congress operates and works. Then we have Congress and the 1995 revolution waged by Newt Gingrich. Massive transformation there after the Democrats had been in power in Congress for a long time. Just one second. Hi.
Oh, sorry, are you busy?
I am.
Oh, okay. I was just wondering if you knew where Dr. Siegel.
I have no idea. Sorry.
All right, thank you.
Problem. So Gingrich came to power on the wave of frustration that put a lot of Republicans into office, but not enough, really, as we learn, to sustain this revolution. And their fervor, if you will, I think, caused them to overplay their hand. And in that regards, then, we can offer some reflections on what it meant to have a revolt in Congress at that time. Then we'll be looking at the Partisan Congress and the executive, which is an interesting topic because, of course, it speaks to this profound tension that's been there since the beginning, probably, really, where Congress is supposed to have a number of powers reserved for itself, but doesn't always get to use them, and sometimes gives them away. And then, as we conclude, we will sort of try to sum up some of our observations. But in general, I think what we can say is that of the three branches of the national government, Congress would appear to be the sort of most obviously sort of natural contender for the title of the sort of the institution that most reflects popular democracy. But as we've seen in developments which we've discussed through the first half of this course already, there's been a lot going on to undercut the democratic potential of Congress. We've talked about lobbyists, for example. And so for that reason, we can say that the US national legislature today is quite a volatile place, a mixture, if you will, of elite and popular democratic potentials. The founding debate over the democratic character of Congress echoes, I think, to this day. Both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists have seen their hopes and fears realized in the contemporary Congress. And it's by no means a perfect institution for either side or for either perspective. And some would say maybe that's exactly as you want it. You don't want either one of these perspectives getting too far ahead of itself. So while it's frustrating for people in some ways, there could be a nice balance that we can observe. But the question, of course, is, how has that balance been faring of late? To many Americans in the late 1980s and early 1990s, Congress was a dirty word. It was seen to be awash in elitist corruption. And on this basis, I think the Republican Revolution that was launched in 1994, in the elections of 1994, promised to carry out something of a cleansing of Congress, right? It was a sort of a populist manifesto. People like Newt Gingrich were at the forefront. And in this lecture, we're going to try to follow through the prism of the 1995 Republican upheaval, looking at how the institution has worked before, during, and after the revolution, and above all, I think, asking the question, did the democratic changes introduced by the Republican Party at that time, in a majority, or as a majority, did despite the fact that it had the numbers in some respects, could it live up to its rhetoric? Could it come through? Whatever the changes that were introduced, it must be said that today most Americans are quite unhappy with Congress. In 2011, it had an 11% approval rating. That's not great, and many expressed dissatisfaction with Congress for reasons I think that should not surprise us too much at this stage. We've looked at the role of interest groups and lobbyists in this course already. We know that congressmen tend to be much wealthier than the average Americans, and that their campaigns are financed by corporations and elite businessmen. In this sense, then, it's no wonder that most Americans do not recognize themselves in the membership of Congress. So why was Congress created? It was, I think, obviously, if we know a little bit of our history, we know enough to say that it was an experience with a king and the so-called stamp tax that made the early founding fathers of this country suspicious of what we might call unipolar regimes, right? That's a regime where the power is invested in just one person. And so the framers intended Congress to be the most powerful branch for the simple reason that it was antithetical to this idea of having a centralized unipolar power. If power could be concentrated, they argued, then it could be abused. And so why you want a distributed form of power in something like Congress is in order to be able to give it a sort of to spread that power out and prevent it doing too much damage, so to speak. So Article 1 of the Constitution deals with the Congress, and to give you an idea of how complex Congress is, we should know that Article 1 is the largest article in the Constitution. So just some definitions really here. We have bicameralism, constituent, chamber constituencies. These are important terms for us to know about. Bicameralism refers to the division of a legislature into two separate chambers or assemblies. We know that the U.S. Congress is a bicameral institution. That is to say, it has these two separate chambers. Each house serves a different constituency, and this goes back, of course, to the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists that we've been talking about. The House, what it was envisioned, would be elected by the people and would therefore represent their views. The Senate was to represent the interests of the state, or the states rather, and each state then would receive two senators. So bicameralism, in the sense that we're describing it here, was a reflection of the existing kind of class structure that America had at the time. The idea that there were sort of elites, well-established people who would want to, see to it that the country was governed in accordance with their interests, but also a recognition that the mass number of people had just come through a war and were of the mind that the people had common sense and that they should be able to govern themselves. So obviously the institutions of the country are going to reflect this tension to a certain extent. What's a constituent, by the way? A person represented by a legislature or some other elected or appointed official. And then we have, of course, the question on the screen here about which constituency each chamber would refer to. Then I think there's also this question of how Congress has been imagined by the people over the generations. I think it's always been seen as one that's where individuals can go to make a difference. And so that brings us to our next point. The Individualistic Congress. Prior to 1995, Congress was, in fact, a lot less partisan than it appears to be today. The key dynamic of Congress back then was the fact that individual members would want to get elected and re-elected for their district. And of course, inserted here on the screen, we have a frame from a famous film by Frank Capra called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which I think you should all watch if you've never watched it. It's a film that is not about someone who's elected. Actually, it's about someone who replaces a senator, I think, who's passed away, and but it's very revealing about the nature of how bills are passed and the type of dynamics that existed in that time, which, as we're saying here, are to do with the Individualistic Congress. So what does it mean to say Congress is individualistic prior to 1995? Well, consider how these members were elected. Prior to 1995, the typical congressional candidate was someone who was self-appointed, right? They were maybe in many instances already veterans of local politics, and they were in a sense already kind of like bruised from battle. You know, they were hardened up, tough mothers, you might say, ready to take on politics at a national level in a meaningful way. One of the reasons why congressmen were so tough is because to get their seat they were often up against very established incumbents. These incumbents would have, you know, a lot of experience already as congressmen. They didn't want to lose their job, and they had really worked the system to win favor from their constituents, giving many of them as much as a 98% chance of re-election. So often an incumbent then, that is someone already elected to Congress, would be the darling of lobbyists or political action committees, and he or she would also have accumulated a significant treasure chest to spend on re-election. So in that sense then, sometimes the literature talks about what's called a permanent campaign mindset, right? A permanent campaign, which means these guys were always thinking as if they were up for election. And with that on their minds, then whenever they would go back to their districts, they would be going back there with the idea of trying to win hearts and influence people. So incumbents would have many advantages then over their potential rivals that would want to challenge them, like franking privileges, right? They would get free stamps from their office, and they would be able to spend taxpayer dollars on stamps. And I think that still applies today. They would have travel allowances so that they could go all around and give talks and engage people in public speaking, whereas their potential contenders would have none of those sorts of support. So this gave the incumbents a fairly huge advantage, material advantage over any potential rivals. Another advantage is that the individualistic congressman could engage in casework, what we call casework. Congressmen, seen by the electorate as a kind of ombudsperson, an investigator, if you will, of constituent problems, someone able to use their power and influence to, as they say, cut through the red tape of federal bureaucracy, or maybe even state bureaucracy. Now, of course, we don't want to say that that's a bad thing, right? Casework is a very important part of a politician's job, not just representing the interests of the people of his region, but also, making sure that he can help people. It's not what we think of politicians as doing, I suppose, in the classical sense, but it makes sense that they do it. But the downside is that it gives congressmen the power to, sort of dole out favors, and it makes those constituents therefore more likely to support the congressman during re-election. So the bottom line then, in this era, congressmen held their positions through their own extensive efforts, and then that was their power base, right? And the party leaders, even though they were members of political parties, neither the party leader nor the president could really dictate to them what they ought to think or how they ought to vote. I mean, obviously sometimes, but not as much as today, for sure. So for that reason then, we say that individualistic motivations and practices prevailed in the legislature prior to 1995. Now, in this slide, we looked at a little bit more to do with the Individualistic Congress. I want to talk about some of the basic. Now, in previous times when I've given this lecture, I've gone into much more detail here, but I think really just for the sake of what we're doing, probably just a little bit of detail is necessary. We want to talk about different types of committees. The committee system is important for our discussion because up to 1995, it was the system whereby most of the work in Congress was done. In fact, today it's still that system, but things have changed a little bit as we'll learn. The members in the Congress are going to break out into smaller groups, bipartisan groups, to work on bills, and then this means that the profile of an individual politician is going to be very much attached to the profile of the committee, because these things are often long-standing committees and they don't just go away, right? So that's our first type of committee, is the standing committee, the most important, because all bills in both chambers are referred to them. And there's other types to consider as well: select committees, which are more temporary and then cease to exist once they've achieved their goals. And then we have the joint committees, which are established with members of both chambers serving on the same committee, senators and congressmen all together. And we'll get to iron triangles in just a moment. But so given the priority and importance attached to having a position in a good committee, right? You want to be in a committee that has a high profile and that seems to be doing something important, like something to do with armed forces or budget, something with real teeth, right? That has power that everyone else would be scared of you. Having an assignment on a standing committee is really, really important for a congressman. Once a member has joined one of these sorts of committees, a standing committee, a select committee, or a joint committee, usually the pattern is to remain there, especially, of course, for these standing committees that are much more long-term. So within the committee system then, because a lot of people have been there sometimes for years, they develop familiarity with each other, and there's a tradition in the Congressional Committee that they give the leadership of the committee to the most senior person, regardless of the political party. They give the chairmanship of the party to the most senior member, the oldest member that is in the chair. So legislators often join a particular committee because they wish to serve interest groups that are important in their home districts or states. These legislators form alliances with the major interest groups and executive agencies with which their committees interact. And I think another benefit of the committee system was the expertise it gave to long-standing members. It gave them a lot of credibility, and it was important for them to have this if they were going to get into a public, if ever they were going to get into a shooting match with the White House, right? A dispute or a big public debate of some sort with the White House, which is often heavily staffed by experts and has a lot of experts to back up its repertoire of knowledge. So congressional committees can hire their own experts, of course, and so playing fire with fire is an option. But I think it's very important for the committee and for the congressman to be seen to have already their own basic knowledge, right? To be sort of up to par, up to speed on it. It's a prestige thing, and with prestige, of course, comes getting re-elected and being seen to be wise and all the rest. So there's definitely a need to have your committee staffed with smart people. Now, the one other topic that we have on this slide refers to this triangle, right? It's the idea that there's an iron triangle that exists in the way Congress and congressional committees operate. We've talked a little bit about the fact that that congressmen in the past, we've talked about how they are subject to the lobbying of various interest groups. And so it won't surprise you then if I tell you that oftentimes when Congress is trying to consider legislation and they're going through their deliberations, the point is to bring in experts to stand before the committees and answer various questions. And the congressional system is going to try to entertain, in theory anyway, often the desires of the interest groups to frame problems certain ways and to frame the need for certain solutions, which of course are perceived to be the optimal solutions on the part of the interest groups. If the interest group is a wealthy one and has a large industrial sort of set of interests behind it, then I think it's safe to say that congressmen might be subject to influence in a material sense. Congressmen, of course, know that they're not elected for life, and they may need to have a career planned for when they're out of office. And so it makes sense that they would have a strong interest in appeasing the interest groups. And the executive agencies play a role in this as well, because they are wanting to be seen to be solid bets on the part of the government and the interest groups. They want to be seen to be team players. And so the triangle constituted by these interests, where everyone's getting something they want from it, it's good for them, but it's not necessarily good for democracy, because it means that congressmen may be less inclined to pay attention to the wishes of their constituents and much more likely to pay attention to the desires of these triangles. So in a sense then, that brings us to the end of our reflection of the Individualistic Congress. Of course, we cannot do a class on Congress without thinking about how a bill is passed. And I know most of you have thought about this before, because you've taken probably some sort of government class before where you talk about this, whether it was in high school or what have you, right? But this is a flow chart that just explains how the committees specifically are relevant here, in case you didn't quite understand what I was just referring to a moment ago. That legislation can be introduced in the House or in the Senate, and it gets referred to a committee which holds hearings, which we were just talking about, inviting those experts in, and then recommending or not passage of the bill to the House. And then the House will then debate whether the bill should be passed or not, and then they'll have to have some sort of compromise on language, because having been debated in separate chambers, it stands to reason that the legislation might not be in the same language for each group. So the resultant legislation will need to be sort of finessed so that it has one framework of language. And so they get their compromise bill, goes to the president, and it gets signed or not by the president. He has the power to veto a bill, but he doesn't have the power to change it. So this is the thing then. All bills go through the House and Senate before reaching the president, and the president has the final say. And he can pass it back to Congress if he's not happy with what they've done. So one thing we have to discuss before we move on to the revolution of 1995, which is our third factor actually, is that of political parties. It may be a rather kind of strange thing to mention at this juncture, but the Constitution doesn't mention political parties, and they have kind of come about on their own. Some would even say that the parties hijacked Congress, right? You do occasionally get independents, like Bernie Sanders, for example, at the moment, elected to Congress, but almost all of the members belong to one of the two major parties. So we have to ask this question about the parties then. What are they, right? They're vehicles through which the House and the Senate are organized. They were not foreseen by the framers, we know that, but they exist and they have a lot of power now. And they've invented roles and institutions within their ranks to exert power in the system, even though the Constitution doesn't elaborate on these positions at all. So they're kind of fictional in some ways, right? They don't really have legal standing. But the parties have, through these various positions of leadership and the sort of faith that they've invested in them, they've really created a power structure, right? Because we were talking about committees a moment ago. Well, how do you get on a committee? That's determined by the parties. So the committees, the committee leadership are determined on the basis of this party monopoly. The parties come together in gatherings outside of Congress. They're called caucuses by the Democrats and conferences by the House Republicans, and both parties in the Senate will choose leaders to run their institutions and sometimes set policy directions as well. So one thing we want to talk about is, now that we've sort of identified the parties as powerful structures, it must be said that even despite this power, the political parties in the States were never really, in the United States, were never really as powerful as they were in places like Ireland, Australia, Britain, which have a more like recognizably parliamentary system where the executive is invested in Parliament, and that's the key distinction, right? America separates the Parliament from the executive. The executive is the presidency, so you have a division there. Whereas in Britain and in Ireland, the Prime Minister is the executive, or the powers of the executive are in the cabinet, more precisely. So, so compared to that system, there's obviously a huge difference there in terms of power and distribution of power. That started to change a little bit in the 1980s, and in fact, it may have even started to change, you know, as early as the 60s. Some people would argue that when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law, I mean, Lyndon Johnson himself argued this, that he was losing the South for the Democratic Party for the foreseeable future. You know, I can't remember the exact quote, but what he meant was that he foresaw in signing the Civil Rights Act a rearticulation of the way parties were organized, and I think it became true, right? It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Democratic Party majority, I think, perhaps started its decline then, you might say. So Lyndon Johnson was recognizing that by signing the Civil Rights Act, that he was changing the way people would relate to the Democratic Party. And what this did was it created a kind of a dysfunctionality, not just in the Democratic Party, but I think in both political parties to an extent, right? Because in principle, the Democratic Party would, you know, set out to represent popular democratic concerns. But a large number of its members are not activists, and this is, I think, the sort of schizophrenia of the Democratic Party, and always has been. The Democratic Party leadership always seem quite happy to take the status quo and the dominance of business as a kind of a thing that's just part of the process, yet their activist base seems to reject that and maybe be more to the left of the actual representatives. So many people would say, you know, accusatorily, that the Democratic Party leadership seems to make more hay out of giving the Republican presidents a hard time than supporting the mandate of Democratic presidents. So the core constituents do tend to become disillusioned and occasionally will drift away from the Democratic Party. I think that's a problem they've always had. So if the Democratic Party is in decline today, we can, I think, attribute it to a certain sort of dysfunctionality. So, last but not least, we want to talk about congressional leadership as a factor in influencing how our elected representatives function in Congress. And you remember from the way I've been sequencing this that we are describing the pre-1995 context, and we're building up to an argument which will be coming in the next couple of slides about how some of this has changed. We used to be saying that the individuals were basically mostly about re-election and had their own priorities pretty much established for themselves. That now seems to be changing, and well, we'll get to that in a moment, but just briefly then on the point of congressional leadership. Members of the House of Representatives choose their speaker, shall we say the American equivalent of a prime minister, and other officers. They come together and they do that. They decide together. Now the speaker is the most powerful member. Currently, it's Boehner, who is the 61st and current Speaker of the House of Representatives. Numerous responsibilities, the most important of which is to seek the reenactment of his or her party's legislative proposals. So that is the sort of main goal of the majority leader. Now following that, there's the speaker. Following the speaker, then, there is the majority leader, and he is the second in line of the majority party leadership. Then we have the minority leader, who's the source of the sort of loyal opposition, and their job is to be debating with whoever's in power the merits of their various proposals. Other positions we need to think about are the whips, and their job is to make sure that the rank and file are kept in line to a certain extent. Now, the whips have not always been very effective, and historically the congressional leaders have found it difficult to command their rank and file members. That has changed somewhat in recent years. The 1970s began to see a phase where this got strengthened. So, for example, the Speaker would be able to name a majority of the Rules Committee, which decides how much time is allotted to a floor debate on a bill and what kind of amendments to a bill would be considered. Over in the Senate, leadership was a bit more hamstrung than that in advancing their party's agenda. Individual senators, of course, could attach unrelated, riders, inserts to any bill on the floor, while the majority party could also block legislation because they have the power of the filibuster, which we will discuss more. But there's not much you could do about a filibuster, except if you have a majority of 3/5, you can call for a movement of cloture, but that's very, very hard to do because usually Senate is pretty heavily balanced, or pretty finely balanced. So, okay, we said we were building on to the 1995 revolution, and now here it is. The gentleman in the image here is Newt Gingrich, and the question is, how is he going to pull off his revolution? Well, it was a Republican revolution, and it was the revolution that swept away what we've up to this moment been calling the Individualistic Congress. In 1994, there was a palpable sense of public anger that focused entirely on the Democrats and their majorities in the House and the Senate, and they got crushed in an election, what you might call an electoral tidal wave. This led to the GOP takeover, which was, basically the result of a decade of partisan strategizing and guerrilla actions by Newt Gingrich, who was the Republican leader. As he became the Speaker of the House, Gingrich was sort of at the center of articulating a vision for how things were going to be different from here on in. He became a very powerful Speaker of the House. Indeed, he's often said to be the most powerful speaker since the early years of the 20th century. Now, Gingrich consolidated power. He chose, he loaded the committees with his key people, sometimes bypassing the traditional seniority system. Typically, as we mentioned, it would be the oldest member of the committee that would have the seniority. And he controlled the committee assignments. He oversaw rules that changed, rule changes rather, that weakened committee and subcommittee independence, so-called task forces he introduced, with members handpicked by himself, right? So they're not part of this committee structure, they're task forces, but then they're sort of breaking away from the sort of traditionally agreed rules that navigate and control how committees are going to be organized. So by setting up a task force sort of off the balance sheet, so to speak, gives him a lot more power to frame legislation, to sort of pre-prepare everything and not to negotiate it, right, but to bring it in sort of pre-prepared. So in this sense then, his plan was to build a Republican program in Congress. He called it the Contract with America, and he argued that it should be a unifying agenda for Republicans. Now, he did push it very firmly. He applied his political muscles to the task, you might say, and he brought even reluctant supporters onto his timetable. Even after a balanced budget replaced the contract as the centerpiece of the GOP agenda, he still had quite an impressive amount of power potential just because of his negotiating skills, his consensus building skills. And he treated his Democratic opponents as foes in a political war. I think it was a real change in cultural sort of dynamics of Congress, right? It was going to be much more combative, much more about party versus party, and less about congressmen as a collection of individuals who just happened to be in separate parties. So by the end of 1995 then, which was the year of the revolution, Congress was a different place than the way it started, right? The Republicans had attempted to reverse the factors shaping congressional behavior. We've talked about individualism first, moving through, party and leadership. This is all going to be reversed now. It's going to be the leadership, the party, the committee, and the individual following in lockstep. And that was the plan. Has it been successful? I think, well, it depends on how you measure it. I don't think the Contract with America was particularly successful in terms of achieving its legislative goals, but it certainly changed the dynamics of how Congress is going to be run. And it was certainly obstructionist as well, and I think that prevails to the present day. And we will discuss that now, because if the Individualistic Congress was the Congress that came before, now we have the Partisan Congress. So let's here discuss the Partisan Congress. Today, there's a high level of mutual hostility in Congress. Partisan Congress has, different phases of it since 1995, and we can see some of the sort of main phases and figures that emerge out of it. 1999 to 2006, the House Republicans were headed by a pair of leaders, Speaker Hastert and Majority Leader Tom DeLay, who we talked about a little bit before. He was the guy that got put in jail for his interactions with lobbyists. The political scientist Ross Baker observed that Speaker Hastert, and this is kind of like a famous quote just to give you an idea of the character of the leadership, right? A very, very tough partisan who hid behind a kind of cuddly teddy bear exterior. Interesting language. DeLay, of course, was always the more hard-hitting and influential of the two. He was known as the Hammer. Boom, I think we saw that in the documentary we watched. He was the one kind of who continued the Gingrich tradition, building a large, efficient, mechanized Republican Party, if you will. He made sure that the rank-and-file Republicans towed the revolutionary line. He put the fear into Washington lobbying firms. He said that unless they dropped their willingness to work in bipartisan fashion and would only henceforth hire Republicans, that they'd be frozen out of the House leadership, right? So the new kids were in town, and they were going to take over. Now, the Democrats took power back in 2007. They brought stronger party leadership than they had featured during the Individualistic Congress. And so you can see that because the Republicans changed strategy, the Democrats responded in kind of like an arms race, you might say. And who came with them? Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. They were fairly aggressive partisan figures. And I think they learned from the Republican example. They decided to take control of the congressional agenda in this very sort of party-structured way. Like the Republican leaders in the Partisan Congress, Pelosi and Reid, they would sort of often bypass the traditional committee structure and the traditional way of doing things in the committee to try to get around the senior established chairs to try to establish important bills and legislation of their own. And they were somewhat successful in taking a disparate Democratic Party and unifying it into a legislative majority. But they were not really that willing to come out under the shadow of their president, as we now know. So that is that. What about today? Today, I think it's safe to say the Congress has never been more partisan. If it couldn't appear to be any worse, it obviously has got worse amid the deepest economic crisis since the Great Depression. Obviously, with conservatives being very angry and mobilized to vote and wanting change in their own party, the Tea Party came to the fore and became a very major presence in the Republican Party. Not by any means the majority, but enough of a large number to change the direction of the Republican Party, because if they would obstruct and refuse to vote, then the Democrats would win, and that's the way it balanced out. So all these people, these Tea Party people, wondered what had happened to the hope and change that Obama had promised in 2008. It was the basis of this stunning Republican comeback, and they won huge victories in the congressional elections of 2010, taking back majority control in the House and shrinking the Democrats' margin of control in the Senate. Now, the costs of this development, I think, for anyone who studies the news these days, are apparent, right? It's a very polarized situation, and that means that there's not a lot of conversation going on across the aisles, especially when measured against our aspirations, our ideals for the behavior of congressmen. I think the current lack of bipartisan effort in Congress is disappointing. What we have is a sort of an on-again, off-again swap and rotate between the two different parties, both of them engaging in a kind of a partisan strategy to ram through their agenda before their time runs out. And without enough time then to really sort of, or consideration, if you will, even for debate, for deliberation between these parties, I think what we have is a situation whereby the thing that Congress is supposed to be known for, its distinctive value, that is as a place for debate, sort of becomes irrelevant almost. Well, I think the reality is that Congress is becoming an acrimonious place, not a place where higher ideas and thoughts are going to be on display, and that's disappointing. Moving swiftly along, Congress and the executive. Not too much I want to say here, really. I could do a whole lecture on this topic alone, but I'll just try to keep this one short and get to the end of our lecture because we're running out of time. In the 20th century, balance of political power has shifted from Capitol Hill to the White House. There's often a tension between these institutions on budgetary matters. During the 1970s, Congress decided to reassert its budgetary power through the Budgetary and Impoundment Control Act of 1974, and this, you don't need to remember the name of the bill, but just what you do need to know is that this was a sort of a time where Congress was asserting itself over what was seen to be a skyrocketing deficit. You may remember this was the decade of the oil spikes and the end of the Bretton Woods system, where President Nixon cut the gold standard that the US dollar had been back to. So, and US borrowings had started to go up very, very high then, and it was freaking people out. So Congress invents the Congressional Budget Office, which is to try to set up a new budget resolution process, and it increased both congressional power, and it also increased conflict between the legislative and executive branches. In the Reagan years then, despite the fact that Reagan always talked about cutting the deficit, he left it very, very high. I think possibly because he was spending so much money on the Star Wars program at the time, the Star Wars Defense, or SDI initiative, which was going to try to do all kinds of things, from putting satellites in space that could shoot down lasers and rockets on the ground that could shoot incoming missiles. Congress really got upset about deficit, I think, around about that time. It wasn't really until Clinton, however, that the deficit started to get cut. Today, how does Congress relate to the executive office? Well, I think, after some time of budgets being balanced and all the rest, we're sort of back in it again. We are cutting taxes and yet increasing the amount we're spending. So the spending has to be borrowed. And that, of course, is what drives the deficit. Americans don't seem to like paying taxes, and who can blame them? But taxes you must pay if you want to pay for your government, right? So the wars, I think, have been the real controversy in the last little while, and the wars are certainly high dollar items on the spending priorities list. Just thinking about foreign policy as well, Congress, the book doesn't really discuss this as much, but I think it's important to mention that the Constitution also gives Congress significant powers in this area, such as the responsibility for raising military forces and the Senate's authority to ratify treaties. After Watergate and Vietnam, Vietnam, of course, being seen as a debacle, like getting stuck in Vietnam, getting stuck in quicksand. Of course, Watergate had seemed to be a very major overstepping of the line by the executive branch. So the critics, of course, were going to come out and say that Congress, in taking this power back, was creating problems because Congress tends to act slowly or indecisively, and politically not to be such an effective force, especially when it comes to foreign policy. But those inadequacies, many people would argue on the other side, are exaggerated. Congress is justifiably less inclined to take the country to war. It's the people's chamber, and the people will not re-elect you if you vote for war. Presidents seem to be a little bit more immune to that because the stakes are so high and the whole country is just voting for one of two people, right? They're high-profile positions. But congressmen, because they're much more connected to their immediate communities, it's argued they're much less likely to sort of go off in wars of adventure. I don't know how true that is, but it is an argument that people suggest. So, Congress and the executive. Last but not least today, just to note, and the book doesn't really go into this, but I think it's important to note that there's only a few women serving in Congress, and I think that's sad for a number of reasons, It means that women's ideas, women's ways of behaving are not admitted into Congress, and so it's a very male-centric, male-dominated zone, and the modes of behavior in there are very masculine as well. That's probably something we'd like to see change. It's not great in Europe either, but there's certain places where it's getting better. We have then in Congress only 71 out of 435 House members, 16 out of 100 senators. Compare those statistics with Norway, where it's 37%, and in Sweden, where it's 45%. So that's just something to think about. So anyway, there you go. That's pretty much the lecture for today. To conclude, I suppose I would say the Republican Revolution is significant. I think it explains where we are today. I think it explains to a certain extent that by putting the party leadership and the party systems at the front of the dynamics of how the behavior of our elected representatives is shaped, it's a bit ugly in relation to our democratic hopes, at least. I think Gingrich's Republican Revolution, however, probably has failed. It failed in many ways because it didn't have the legitimacy it thought it had. Realistically, only 1/5 of the eligible electorate voted for it in the first place, right? And it was not a huge turnout. So how much of a mandate do you have to really start introducing some crazy legislation? The telling sign, I think, of the role of elite democracy in the Republican Revolution was the lack of interest in campaign finance reform. That's the sort of canary in the coal mine, so to speak. But it's still open as to whether this can change. Can there be a democratic revitalization of Congress? I think that's an important question. And I think Congress clearly, whatever happens, it remains crucial to the future of popular democracy in the United States. Thanks very much for your time today, guys.